The dignity of African people demands more from us, and as we speak about African unity and Pan-Africanism, we must confront one of the greatest dangers facing the continent today: Afrophobia. What some call xenophobia against fellow Africans is in truth Afrophobia, which is the hatred, suspicion, exclusion, and criminalization of African people by fellow Africans themselves. We must also be honest that Afrophobia is not new, and it did not begin in South Africa in 2008 or 2015. It is part of a long colonial strategy designed to divide African people, weaken solidarity, and make unity impossible. Colonialism survived by convincing Africans that they were strangers to one another. The Berlin Conference divided us artificially into Anglophone, Francophones, Lusophones, Arab Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, North Africa, East Africa, Western Africa, and Southern Africa, not for our benefit, but to fragment African identity and prevent continental unity. From slavery to colonialism, to neocolonialism, to modern financial domination, the pattern has remained the same. Africa is valued for its mineral, labor, land, strategic position, and markets, but African lives themselves are treated as disposable. The world speaks about democracy and human rights, yet throughout history, it has repeatedly supported dictatorship, coups, destabilization campaigns, assassinations, and wars whenever African leaders attempted to exercise genuine sovereignty over African wealth. When Patrice Lumumba demanded control over Congolese resources, he was removed and assassinated. When Thomas Sankara sought to free Burkina Faso from dependency and debt, he was isolated and overthrown. When Muammar Gaddafi promoted African financial independence and continental integration, Libya was destroyed under the banner of humanitarian intervention, leaving instability across the Sahel that continues to this day. The destruction of Libya did not only destroy Libya, it destabilized Mali, Niger, Chad, Sudan, and the border region through weapons, militant activities, trafficking networks, and migration crisis. This is how imperialism functions. One African country is weaponized against another, instability in one region becomes a crisis for neighboring states, and divisions weaken the continental collectively. White supremacy understood very early that a united Africa will become an unstoppable political and economic force, and so division became a weapon. We have seen painfully examples of this throughout modern African history. In 1969, the government of Ghana, under those orders, expelled hundreds of thousands of undocumented migrants, many of them Nigerians and Western Africans who had contributed to the Ghanaian economy. Years later, during economic crisis in the 1980s, Nigeria retaliated by expelling millions of Western African migrants, including large number of Ghanaians. This cycle of retaliation between the two great African nations demonstrated how quickly economic hardship can be manipulated into hostility against fellow Africans. Instead of confronting neo-colonial economic structure and elite failures, ordinary Africans became targets. In Zimbabwe, the Kukurahundi massacre of the 1980s remained one of the most painful chapters in the post-independence African history. Thousands of Ndebele civilians were killed during brutal state crackdown in Matabeleland. This tragedy reminds us that ethnic chauvinism and political intolerance can become deadly when power is not guided by democratic accountability and Pan-African humanism. Across Northern Africa, many blacks continue to face racism, exploitation, arbitrary detention, slave trafficking, and violence while migrating through Libya, Tunisia, Algeria, and other transit regions. The collapse of Libya Libya, after NATO intervention, intensified the suffering of black African migrants, many of whom were falsely accused of being mercenaries, imprisoned, tortured, sold into slave markets, or abandoned in inhumane conditions. In recent years, inflammatory rhetoric against sub-Saharan Africans, parts of North Africa, has contributed to attacks, discrimination, and expulsion of vulnerable migrants whose only crime was searching for dignity and survival. And of course, we have witnessed repeated waves of anti-African violence in South Africa itself, where migrants from Zimbabwe, Mozambique, Somalia, Ethiopia, Nigeria, Malawi, Congo, and elsewhere have been attacked, displaced, looted, and killed. We must say clearly, this violence can never be justified. An unemployed South African and an unemployed Zimbabwean are both victims of the same global system of inequality and exploitation. A Nigerian street trader and a South African worker are not enemies. A Somali shopkeeper and a township resident are not enemies. The true enemy is the system that keeps African people poor while a tiny elite accumulates wealth. Kwame Nkrumah warned us when he said, "The forces that unite us are intrinsic and greater than the superimposed influences that keeps us apart." Julius Nyerere also reminds us, without unity, there is no future for Africa. Thomas Sankara taught us that imperialism often occurs in more subtle forms: loan, food, aid, blackmail. Part of that subtle imperialism is teaching Africans to fear one another instead of confronting the structure that exploits all of us collectively. We must also never forget that African liberation itself depended on solidarity across borders. South African freedom fighters found refuge in Zambia, Tanzania, Angola, Mozambique, Algeria, Ethiopia, Libya, Zimbabwe, and Nigeria. Mozambique and Angola suffered destabilization and military attacks because they supported the anti-apartheid struggle. Nigeria funded liberation movements across southern Africa. Tanzania became a home for exiled revolutionaries from across the continent, and Algeria trained liberation fighters from anti-colonial movements throughout Africa. No African country liberated itself entirely alone, and that is why Afrophobia is not only morally wrong, it is historically ignorant. It is a betrayal of liberation struggles, a betrayal of Pan-Africanism, and a betrayal of the spirit of 1963 Addis Ababa. Comrades, we must understand something fundamental. In the global system, Africans only truly have one another. Europe will defend European interests. America will defend American interests. China will defend Chinese interests. Africa must defend African interests. Fellow Africans, the dream of Africa, of a united Africa, is not impossible. It is possible to establish a common African currency in the future. It is possible to build integrated rail and transport system from Cape to Cairo. It is possible to establish African-controlled financial institutions that free us from dependency on the IMF and World Bank. It is possible to create visa-free movement across the continent. It is possible to create universities that lead the world into science and medicine. It is possible to create a borderless Africa like Africa was before the Berlin Conference. What is required is political courage, and the EFF remains committed to the total liberation of Africa, not only from neo-colonial rule, but from economic exploitation, inequality, corruption, tribalism, and dependency. As we commemorate Africa Day, let us remember that history will judge our generation not by the speeches we made, but by whether we transformed material conditions of African people. The task before us is clear: unite Africa, industrialize Africa, democratize Africa, defend Africa, liberate Africa economically. There is no room for anyone who wants to hate Africans. There is no room for black on black violence. Africa must stand up and say, we are one, and will never listen to the voice of ignorant people who don't know where we come from. We are who we are because of those who came before us. We are one blood, we are one skin, and we remain the same victims all over the world. Africans are hated in South Africa, Africans are hated in Africa, Africans are hated in the whole global village. And therefore, it is now the time for Africans to show one another love. And this mission should be achieved in our lifetime. I thank you.